All right. Hello, folks. Welcome to the second lecture of week three. I apologize for not getting this up on Monday. It's just one of those days where a lot of stuff kind of piled on all at once. But I'm going to make sure that I get this up so you have it for the rest of the week. So in the first lesson, you learned a little bit about the history of evolutionary thought through time. We went all the way back like more than 2,500 years and looked at some kind of early pre-Socratic discourse. We looked at ancient Greece. We looked at early Christian discourse on evolution, Islam, Taoism, and we looked more broadly at kind of Enlightenment or modern period notions that are kind of leading up to Darwin's articulation of natural selection. And so in this lesson, I'm going to go briefly through natural selection, a little bit of sexual selection, and then talk about the modern synthesis. And I'll give some kind of historical context as I'm going through it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now to get the PowerPoint up. And this is, I think you've seen this before, but this is this is a picture of Raymond Dart. I love this picture because he's like discovered this really cool fossil, which we call Australopithecus africanus, tongue child, specifically is this fossil. It's a juvenile Australopithecus africanus. Dart has the fossil sitting right in front of him. He has got the article that he's published with a description of the fossil, and he looks surly and irritated. And I think it's hilarious. He's just a curmudgeonly old man. But anyways, let's talk about our first mechanisms in evolutionary theory, our first mechanisms through which evolution occurs. First being natural selection. I've read a couple articles about this, so you should be pretty familiar with what natural selection is. And there's also another like YouTube video that talks about it. But I'm going to give you kind of the academic side of it, just so you understand like how we are using natural selection in our kind of everyday life for people that are working with these things. Natural selection is just a process through which organisms adapt to their environment, or populations of organisms become adapted to their environment. Keep in mind that evolution doesn't occur in individuals. Evolution occurs at the lowest level, at the population level, but of course it can happen at higher levels as well. For natural selection, these populations of organisms are living in an environment. And what we observe is that organisms tend to be evolved, suited to those environments. So penguins are adapted to cold weather, camels are adapted to hot weather. For instance, some animals are adapted to high elevation, some animals are adapted to living in water, salt water, fresh water. And we want to understand how they come to be adapted to those. And natural selection is really kind of a simple and elegant mechanism. It tends to be overcomplicated, but it's not really complicated all that much. And it's also not really a thing in terms of like an object that you can go find. So it's like to identify natural selection, it's like trying to go into your body and identify, pull out the digestion and say, here's the digestion. Digestion is a process and an outcome of something. And natural selection is simply the outcome of surviving and reproducing in a world where not everybody does it. So the observations, the facts, to go back to the Gregory article for natural selection, are survival and reproduction are really difficult, and not everybody does it. Organisms that share a genotype, and thus phenotype. Genotype is like your genetic makeup. Phenotype are the suite of traits that you have. So organisms that share a genotype and phenotype that confer some reproductive advantage will see those genotypes and phenotypes become more common in the population. So those are just two basic observations about the world. So this is the definition for natural selection. It's the process through which certain heritable traits become more or less common in a population related to the reproductive success of the organisms as they interact with their environment. So natural selection is just the outcome of reproducing and differential reproductive success. So let's dig into it a little bit. There are three necessary conditions for natural selection to occur. And if all three of these don't occur, then it's not natural selection. Other evolution is still occurring. They're just adaptations, just not occurring. So, we talked about survival being difficult. Not everybody does it. Reproduction being difficult. Not everybody does it. And of course, when you reproduce, that your offspring has to also be able to go on to reproduce. Otherwise, the lineage just ends one generation down the road. So these are the three necessary conditions for natural selection. If each of these aren't met, it's not natural selection. So the first, there must be variation within a population. And so variation is just kind of differences in bodies and in genetic makeup and behavioral patterns within an identified population. And of course, this identified population is living in a specific environment, right? Two, the variation that we've identified must be heritable. Heritable just means you pass it on to your offspring through passing on your genes. And so an example of a heritable trait would be like eye color, hair color, height. An example of variation that's not heritable would be, say I was in a car accident and I lost my arm. That is variation, but that is not variation that is heritable, as in I do not pass that on. If I have children after I lose my arm, I don't pass on my missing arm. So that is variation, but not heritable. So there must be variation in the population, and that variation must be heritable. Three, some of the variation that we've identified that's heritable, some of that heritable variation results in greater reproductive success than others. So organisms that are suited to the environment will see those things that make them suited to the environment just become more common over time in the population. So it's a statistical shift over time as the environment's changing and organisms are having to contend with those changes in the environment. There will be like physical shifts, both physical at the genetic level, but also physical at the level of the body. And that's it. Each of these has to be met. So we can think of something like skin color today. Skin color actually is adaptive in the past, and we'll talk about the adaptive function of skin color. Of course, it's less so today when we're distributed more broadly across the planet. And of course, we have other technologies to mitigate issues with UV exposure. But if we think about skin color today, is skin color variable? Yes. Is it heritable? Yes, right? If you're light-skinned, you're more likely to have light-skinned children. If you're dark-skinned, you're more likely to have dark-skinned children. Does that variation confer greater reproductive success? No. And so not today, it did in the past. Yet again, we'll get to that later, but I don't want to spoil too much for what's coming up. So just because you have dark skin, there's no direct advantage to reproduction. And so it's not allowing us to adapt to our current context, our current environmental milieu. So let's look at an example. Say we have a population of circles, and there are three different phenotypes. There's the red phenotype, the yellow phenotype, and the blue phenotype. Let me get my handy dandy drawer out, and I'll use white. This is generation 1, generation 2, generation 3. Generation 1 up here, we see that there's an even distribution, even statistical distribution. 33% of the population is red phenotype, 33% of the population is yellow phenotype, and 33% of the population is blue phenotype. And they're living in their specific environment. For here, individual 1, individual 2, individual 1 is able to reproduce and have offspring. They have one offspring. Individual 2 does not reproduce. And so at generation 2, now we have a reduction in the frequency of the red phenotype in the population. So red has gone down to 11% in the population overall. Individual 1 in yellow here, you can't really see that in individual 1 in yellow here, has 2 offspring. Individual 2, there's my zoom stuff's in the way. But individual 2 is over here, They have 1 offspring. And so they have a population increase, or this phenotype becomes more common in the population, more common relative to themselves. So there were 2 individuals in the population. Now there are 3 here. The blue phenotype, individual 1, has 3 offspring. 1, 2, 3. Individual 2 has 2 offspring. 1, 2. And so when we look at the general distribution, the frequency of these phenotypes in the population, overall, the yellow phenotype has not changed in terms of its frequency. While there are more overall, the frequency has remained the same because there's a reduction in the frequency here. If we look at the blue, the frequency of the blue has increased substantially. It's over half the population now has the blue phenotype. Toward the generation 3, individual 1 of generation 2 for the red phenotype does not reproduce. And so there's nothing here. Individual, switch back over to black. Individual 1 has 1 offspring. Individual 2 has 2 offspring. Oh, I apologize for my sneeze. And individual 3 has 1 offspring. So that yet again, there's an increase in the overall number of the yellow phenotype in the population by 1. Now, if we look at blue here, individual 1 has 2, individual 2 has 1, individual 3 has 2, individual 1 has 2, individual 2 has 2. So when we look at these frequencies now, we have 0% of the red phenotype left. This means this phenotype has reached what we call fixation. Fixation is just a phenotype either reaches 100% of the population or 0% of the population. So for instance, humans are bipedal, we walk on 2 legs. That trait has reached 100%. It is at fixation in our species. So the red phenotype has reached fixation, 0%. The yellow phenotype is really not substantially changed. They're still at about 1/3 of the population. So while there are more of the yellow phenotypes overall, they have not statistically increased in terms of their frequency. And then of course the blue has increased again to become more than 2/3 of the population. And so in this hypothetical example, we see a decrease in the frequency of red phenotype in the population, not any change really in the yellow phenotype, and substantial changes in the blue phenotype. And this is evolution, and in particular for this example, this is natural selection. There was something else I wanted to say here, but I don't remember exactly what it was. So the blue phenotype is conferring some advantage in the environment, which allow them to be more successful at reproducing. I remember. One of the things I want to point out is this notion of survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest. This is what we often hear natural selection being referred to as. But as you know from the Gregory article, this is actually a misnomer. It doesn't really fit, because while fitness here means reproductive fitness, fitness is measured by the number of offspring an individual has in their lifetime. So the reproductive fitness of individual 1 in generation 2 is 2. The reproductive fitness of individual 1 here is 3. I'm going to clear everything off. And so while this is technically the fittest, as in they have the greatest reproductive success, this phenotype confers the greatest reproductive success, it's not only the fittest that survive, right? Yes, this one extinct, but also works just fine. It while it's not conferring some amazing advantage, it works in the environment and then persists and really doesn't change substantially across the generations in their statistical frequency. So it's not really survival of the fittest so much as survival of the traits that work in the environment. And the traits that don't work, what we see, are eliminated through selection. Oops. One of the things that Darwin didn't seem to really understand when it comes to adaptation and natural selection is Darwin thought that this process was kind of a long, slow shifting change. And Darwin, of course, didn't have access to the robust fossil record that we have today. and of course did not have access to DNA whatsoever. And so the best evidence he had was that it pointed to natural selection being this kind of slow process. But this isn't always the case. And Stephen Jay Gould, who you heard about in the Gregory article, coined this concept, punctuated equilibrium, that as environments stay stable, there's not like huge shifts one way or the other in an environment. The organisms that live in that environment also eventually reach equilibrium. So where there's not adaptation happening, the organisms have kind of they've adapted to the environment that they're living in. So you don't have these huge shifts in adaptation occurring. Evolution is still happening, but mostly through genetic drift, these random fluctuations in gene frequencies. Of course, their niche construction and these other forms are happening as well, which we'll talk about next week. But then that environment that has been stable for long periods of time shifts, something happens, and the organisms either have to adapt to the new circumstances or they go extinct. And one example that we have here is the KT extinction at the KT boundary between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary epochs. And this is where the dinosaurs, the Ornithischian and the Saurischia dinosaurs went extinct. Of course, birds evolved from dinosaurs. They split off from dinosaurs in the Triassic. But there is a asteroid collision or meteorite collision in what's today the Gulf of Mexico, which created a lot of climatic changes and destabilized populations of creatures all over the world, especially animals that were over a few kilograms in weight. Land animals are over a few kilograms in weight, and of course, many aquatic animals as well. So you have the extinction of all of the large-bodied dinosaurs. Of course, the avian dinosaurs, which still exist today, birds are dinosaurs, were small enough and were less affected by the impact and, of course, the subsequent changes that happened. So this opened up all of these ecological niches, and birds and mammals basically kind of filled and reconstructed, reformed the niches that were filled by dinosaurs in the past. So you see this adaptive radiation of mammals and birds in the post-KT world. And so there's a lot of adaptation, a lot of speciation happening as animals are like filling these new niches and their bodies are changing in really rapid ways. And so what Gould is saying when he's saying punctuated equilibrium is that in stable environments, once animals kind of adapt to those environments, natural selection slows down and other mechanisms of evolution take over. They're not adapting so much, but those populations are still changing over time. But when the environment changes radically, then you have really rapid adaptation, because it's the organisms that can, contend with the changes, continue to reproduce and stuff, and the organisms that can't come to terms with the changes through their bodies and their behaviors, those lineages go extinct. And there's three kind of statistical outcomes for natural selection: stabilizing, directional, and disruptive selection. For stabilizing selection, you've got a distribution. Let me get my handy dandy drawer out again. You've got a distribution, statistical distribution of traits. Maybe this is height. This is down here is short, down here is tall. So the farther you go to the right on the x-axis, the taller the individuals get, until you get to the mean, which is right here. And then past that mean, they get taller as you go to the right. And then on the y-axis, this is the y-axis. As you go up on the y-axis, this is just frequency. So you have a mean here. You'll have your standard deviation, and basically most individuals in the population fall in here. And it's short individuals and really tall individuals are less common. So say there's environmental changes that happen which favor the mean. So they favor the kind of in between really tall and really short. So the shortest individuals are selected against, and so the frequency shifts here, and really tall individuals are selected against for this hypothetical example. And so what's left over in the population after a period of time, probably many generations, is going to be individuals that are more towards the kind of middle from the original distribution. For directional selection, using tall and short again, the same original distribution here, but say short and really short individuals, there's some adaptation. Tall individual, let's say hypothetically, just off the top of my head, there's an environmental shift that happens, and so low-lying foods that like fruiting bushes are either less productive in terms of the fruit that they're producing, or they get destroyed. For say there's a terrible forest fire in this area, it destroys all the low-lying bushes, but the trees were high enough, the fruits of the trees are high enough that the trees survived and they're able to continue to produce fruits. Well, individuals that are really short are not going to be able to access those fruits. And so the taller individuals are going to have a reproductive advantage because they're going to be able to extract energy, aka food, from the environment more efficiently than short individuals because they can reach it. And in this case, the tall individuals will become more common, and then the short individuals will become more or less common. To look at the third example of disruptive selection, we'll use tall and short again. And so say there's another environmental change that happens that affects the population. Or actually, we don't even have to do that. Say that the tall individuals start specializing in getting fruit from trees, and the short individuals start specializing in extracting fruits from bushes. And over time, they continue to specialize in those particular kinds of energy extraction. Short individuals are going after the easy to pick, and the tall individuals are going, in order to avoid competition, it's called niche partitioning, by the way, in order to avoid competition with the organisms that are getting fruits in the bushes, they focus primarily on getting from the trees. And so now, while it was one original population, this specialization has resulted in a disruption where the mean is no longer selected for. The mean becomes deleterious, or the mean doesn't confer a reproductive advantage, and you can get more energy, and thus be able to be more successful in reproduction by just focusing on getting short, or just focusing on, if you're tall, just focusing on getting fruit from the trees. Now this can result in a speciation, right? These two individuals, given enough time, will continue to adapt and speciate from one another. They'll diverge, and eventually they could speciate. Now there could be interbreeding. This is called gene flow, and gene flow actually prevents speciation from occurring. Stabilizing selection will maintain a species. So stabilizing selection is a form of evolution, but it maintains a species. It eliminates the poles, the extremes, but it's maintaining the species. For directional, yet again, you can get new species to emerge out of this as well. So it looks like this. So the black dots are going to be individuals that don't reproduce. And so individuals that don't reproduce obviously aren't passing their traits on to future generations. And so the statistical distribution of the population changes. And so this is basically what it looks like when you graph it. So sexual selection. Sexual selection is really subsumed under natural selection, but instead of like the environmental milieu is kind of producing the outcomes, it is mate choice. And so this is an example of a peacock that is trying to woo a peahen, and peahens tend to favor males that have more eye spots. Is my GIF going to play? Maybe. There it goes. So females tend to favor males with more eye spots. And you can test this, right? You can take little sticky circles like you buy at Office Depot and stick them on a peacock's tail. And the females most often choose the males with the most eye spots. And what is happening here is those eye spots are communicating the health of the individual. Individuals that have enough, that are able to get enough food and don't have a large parasite load are able to support the production of these beautiful tails with lots of eye spots. If you're sick, then you're immunocompromised and your body isn't going to be able to develop these like a really robust amount of eye spots. And so the females are basically reading the reproductive health of the males and doing this. And so they tend to select males with more eye spots. Yeah, and this can result in runaway selection. So runaway selection is peacocks are yet again a great example of this. They have these large tails that females favor, and they need these large tails to support all these eye spots. But these large tails are problematic because say there's a predator that's going after the peacock, those tails make it unwieldy to fly, and so they're less likely to escape the predator. So you have this competition between sexual selection and natural selection that's occurring. And of course, if you can't attract the mate, it doesn't matter how well you survive. And so sexual selection will often kind of override kind of other forms of natural selection. All right, so let's move on to the modern synthesis. So Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species in 1859, articulating natural selection as a mechanism, which we had been able to go on and verify and test and whatnot. With the rediscovery of Mendel's kind of principles of heredity, and then the subsequent work in genetics and genomics in future generations after that point in the early 20th century, we don't just look at bodies to understand how evolution occurs. We also look at genomes. So we look at the genetic makeup of individuals within a population to understand the statistical distribution of alleles. And alleles are simply forms of genes. And so at the genetic level, there's a couple of things that can happen. For sexually reproducing organisms like us, we can produce variation simply by mating. I have a different genetic makeup than the person I have a baby with. And our two genetic makeups get randomly assorted together during reproduction. And so we have a new individual that is neither a copy of me nor a copy of the person I have a baby with. For single-celled organisms, they're relying mostly on mutations, although there's horizontal gene transfer, not something that we really need to talk about too much here. But of course, mutations happen in sexually reproducing organisms as well. And there are lots of different types of mutations. But what you need to understand here is that most mutations are either neutral or deleterious. They don't do anything at all to affect the body or affect reproductive success, or they're bad and they result in no reproduction or no survival. Some of them can confer positive benefits. Neutral mutations, by the way, can in the future potentially result in positive benefits as well. And actually happens much of the time when there are neutral mutations that occur in coding regions of the DNA. And DNA is carried in your chromosomes, and each chromosome is made up of DNA, and within the chromosome, some of that DNA codes for proteins that do stuff in your body. Those coding regions of your DNA are what we call genes. So mutations happen in a population, and these mutations introduce variation. Gene flow is another mechanism through which evolution occurs. So mutation changes the frequencies by the introduction of new variation. Gene flow is the movement of DNA between populations. And so gene flow, if natural selection results in adaptation and can eventually result in speciation, or the emergence of new species from a parent population, gene flow prevents that from happening. As long as there's genes moving between populations, they're very, very unlikely to diverge from one another and thus become new species. So distant populations tend to experience less gene flow, and really close populations tend to experience greater gene flow. And so what you're seeing here is you have two populations of birds. This population on the right here has this pink phenotype, and their allele is big A, big A. So that's their allele. Then you have a population of blue birds over here. And these blue birds have a different allele, little a, little a. So their genetic makeups are different. The frequency of big A in this population is 0%. The frequency of little a in this generation, or in this population, is 0%. Okay. But if there's gene flow that occurs, this individual is moving into this population. What you have now is the introduction of little a, little a. So at first you have 5 individuals, so 20% of the population, 20% of the alleles in the population is little a, right? So there's 2 little a's and there's 8 big a's. And so we can calculate. So say the blue bird mates with one of the red birds. So the blue bird is allele AA, or they have the alleles A and little a, and say each of these is an allele, by the way. So, and then these together make the genotype. So this bird is big A, this bird's little a. So we can calculate using a Punnett square the statistical probability of each of the genotypes. So this will give us big A, this, or big A, little a. This will give us big A, little a, right? Big A, little a, big A, little a. This one will do the same. So 100% of the offspring between this blue bird and this pink bird is going to be little a, big A. This is what we call heterozygotic. Hetero meaning different, zygote being the genotype. And so if they were little, so this individual, little a is homozygotic recessive. Typically recessive alleles are indicated by a lowercase letter, and dominant alleles are indicated by an uppercase letter. So if, say, this individual that one of these, say this is the one that's born. So we'll move them over here, and they mate with another individual that's big A over here. Now we can get big A, big A, big A, big A. So 50% is going to be homozygotic dominant. And then 50% is going to be, so if they have infinite number of offspring, by the way, this is what could happen. So the probability of homozygotic dominant is 50%. The probability of heterozygotic is 50% here. The probability of heterozygotic here is 100%. So we can calculate the probabilities of the outcomes of their offspring. So gene flow can introduce new alleles, as you're seeing in the picture. It also prevents speciation. Genetic drift might seem complicated, but in short, it is just the random fluctuations that result from reproduction in a population over time. So reproduction, who one mates with, is not random, but is also has some random dynamics to it. And so, and of course, the amount of babies that one has is not determined by their adaptive advantage. So like I have one child and I'm not having any more children, despite how adaptive I am to the world, right? So there are lots of factors that go into shaping how many offspring, not just one's not one's ability to survive and reproduce in the world. That just sets a limit on how many offspring they can have. So genetic drift is simply just the random fluctuations of gene frequencies over time. And there's no forces shaping genetic drift at all. It's totally random in a population that is stable, that's unbounded. There is a factor that can shape that can cause genetic drift. And this is what we call the bottleneck effect or the founder's effect. So say you have a population of, let's go with 5 individuals. So we'll do the phenotype for these 2 is white. The phenotype for these 3 is white. The phenotype for these 2 is red. So let's say let's calculate the frequencies really quickly. So the frequency of white in this population is 20, 40, 60%. So 60% of the population, the frequency of the white phenotype is 60%. The phenotype of the red phenotype is 40%. And so let's say there is something happens, and say these 3 individuals leave the group and they go elsewhere. So now the frequency of the red in this new population is 66%, and white in this new population is 33%. So while the white phenotype was dominant, was the most common in the parent population, it is the least common in the new population. So we have this shift, and it has nothing to do with adaptation whatsoever. And then, of course, now the white allele in the parent population, where the break happened, is 100%. So now you've got, this has changed to this has changed to this, right? So there are changes in the frequencies of these traits in the populations over time. All right, let me stop sharing. So that's basically natural selection and the modern synthesis, kind of the expansion of natural selection and Darwinian, what we call Darwinian evolution, into the 20th century. Next week, we're going to talk about the further expansion of our understandings of evolution next week.